One stroke of a sword, one perfectly timed strike, that's all it took to change the destiny of nations. Picture this: two armored figures standing face to face on a misty battlefield, the weight of entire dynasties resting on their shoulders. The clash of steel wasn't just about skill or survival. It was about power, legacy, and the unbreakable will to reshape the world. Welcome to a journey through time, where we'll uncover 23 legendary duels that didn't just decide the fates of warriors, but altered the course of medieval history itself. These weren't mere fights. They were pivotal moments where kingdoms rose, empires crumbled, and the balance of power shifted forever. Think about the stakes. A single duel could determine whether a family name vanished into obscurity or rose to rule for centuries. Behind every legendary clash was a web of ambition, rivalry, and sometimes pure desperation. Stories of kings and knights who gambled everything on their blade's edge. From the sun-baked fields of Spain to the frozen forests of Scandinavia, these duels became the stuff of legend, whispered about in taverns and chronicled in royal courts. What drove these warriors to risk it all? Was it honor, revenge, or the unshakable belief that one man's skill could defy the tides of fate? This is more than a recounting of battles. It's a window into the hearts and minds of those who shaped the medieval world. Each duel will explore Carrouges' echoes of the past, lessons about courage, cunning, and the unpredictable twists of history. You'll meet kings who fought their own battles, rivals whose hatred transcended generations, and underdogs who the odds. By the end, you'll see how these face-offs weren't just isolated events, but threads woven into the grand tapestry of Europe's story. So ready your imagination. We're stepping onto the battlefield, where every strike could rewrite history. Imagine a world where the law wasn't decided by judges or juries, but by the clash of steel. In medieval Europe, trial by combat wasn't just spectacle or sport. It was a sacred ritual, a divine courtroom where God himself was believed to preside. When two nobles faced off, their swords weren't merely weapons. They were instruments of justice, and the outcome was seen as heaven's verdict. This wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about faith, honor, and the unshakable belief that righteousness would prevail. The roots of this practice ran deep. For centuries, societies had turned to ordeals, fire, water, combat, to settle disputes when human judgment seemed fallible. But trial by combat held a unique prestige, reserved for the nobility who saw themselves as God's chosen warriors. A knight who triumphed didn't just win a fight, he proved the moral weight of his cause. Lose, and it wasn't just his life at stake. His family's name, lands, even their legacy could crumble in an instant. What made these duels so gripping was the sheer drama of it all. Picture the scene: a hushed crowd, the tension thick enough to cut with a dagger, as two armored figures took their oaths before priests and lords. The combatants weren't just fighting for themselves. They stood as champions for entire families, factions, or even kingdoms. Victory could mean the return of stolen lands, the vindication of a slandered reputation, or the right to rule. Defeat, often it meant disgrace or death. But here's the twist: these duels weren't always fair fights. The rules were intricate, favoring those who knew how to manipulate them. A clever noble might demand combat knowing his opponent was aged or injured. Others hired champions, fearsome warriors who fought in their place. And sometimes, the very belief in divine justice was weaponized. Psychological warfare where confidence in one's righteousness could unnerve an opponent before the first blow was struck. This blend of faith, law and raw combat made trial by combat one of history's most fascinating contradictions. It was a system that could elevate the virtuous or be exploited by the cunning. And when the dust settled, the consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield, reshaping alliances, toppling dynasties, and rewriting the future of nations. The Siege of Antioch had dragged on for months, with Crusader forces exhausted, starving, and on the brink of despair. Then came the challenge, a towering warrior, a champion of the city's defenders, striding forth to taunt the Christian army. He was a giant among men. His very presence meant to crush what little morale remained. But from the Crusader ranks stepped of Bouillon, a knight whose name would soon echo through history. What followed wasn't just a duel, it was a turning point, a moment where one man's courage rewrote the fate of thousands. The clash was anything but even. Though a seasoned warrior faced an opponent who seemed invincible, a brute of legendary strength, armed with a massive scimitar that could cleave a man in two. Yet as they circled each other on that dusty plain outside Antioch's walls, something extraordinary happened. Didn't rely on brute force. Instead, he fought with precision, patience, and a tactical mind that turned the giant's size against him. Every missed swing from the champion left him unbalanced. Every roar of frustration made him sloppier. Then, in a flash of steel, struck a single perfect blow that felled the giant like an oak. The impact was immediate. The defenders of Antioch, who had watched in anticipation, now recoiled in horror. Their champion lay dead, and with him their confidence shattered. For the Crusaders, it was as if divine favor had finally shown its hand. Its victory reignited their belief that their cause was just, that heaven itself marched with them. Within weeks, Antioch fell, and the path to Jerusalem lay open. But the duel's significance ran deeper than morale. In that moment, wasn't just a knight, he became a symbol. His willingness to face impossible odds, to risk everything when his army needed hope most, marked him as more than a warrior. He was a leader, chosen not just by men, but, in the eyes of many, by God. When Jerusalem was captured the following year, it was no surprise that the Crusaders turned to him as their ruler. His reign as defender of the holy began not with a coronation, but with a duel, one that proved destiny often hinges on the courage of a single man. This was the power of medieval single combat, a fight that decided not just lives, but legacies. Story reminds us that history isn't always shaped by armies or politics. Sometimes, it's forged in the space between two men, where skill, faith, and sheer determination collide. William Marshal was barely more than a squire when he stepped onto the tournament field at Mans, his future hanging by a thread. The year was 1177, and the air crackled with tension, not just from the clash of swords, but from the unspoken stakes. This wasn't just another contest of skill. It was a proving ground where a young man with nothing but his name and his blade could rewrite his destiny. His opponent, a seasoned knight who had already dismissed Marshal as unworthy, a mere boy in armor. What followed wasn't just a duel. It was the moment fate chose to smile on one of history's most extraordinary warriors. The fight itself was in turning the tables. Marshal, outmatched in experience, fought with a combination of raw talent and sheer audacity that left spectators breathless. Where his rival relied on brute force, Marshal used agility and wit, dodging crushing blows and countering with precision strikes. The crowd, initially favoring the older knight, soon erupted as the underdog gained the upper hand. When Marshal finally disarmed his opponent and stood victorious, sword pointed at the fallen knight's throat, he did more than win a match. He seized his future. But the true brilliance of this duel lay in its aftermath. King Henry II, watching from the stands, saw something rare in the young warrior, not just skill, but the unshakable poise of a born leader. That victory became Marshal's ticket into royal service, the first step in a journey that would see him rise from landless knight to regent of England. Over decades, he would become the stabilizing force behind 5 monarchs, a man whose loyalty and tactical genius saved the Plantagenet dynasty during its darkest hours. What makes this duel so pivotal isn't just the clash of steel. It's the way it reveals the medieval world's peculiar alchemy of merit and opportunity. In an era where birthright often dictated destiny, Marshal proved that a single display of excellence could shatter expectations. His story reminds us that legends aren't always born. Sometimes, they're forged in the heat of a tournament field, where one man's courage and cunning can echo through centuries. France in the year 1386 was a kingdom simmering with tension, nobles jostling for power, alliances shifting like sand, and honor prized above all else. Into this volatile world stepped Jean, a knight whose name would become forever tied to one of the most dramatic judicial duels in history. His opponent, a man accused of an unspeakable crime against wife, Marguerite. But this wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a collision of pride, politics, and a legal system that placed the sword above testimony. The accusation alone was enough to send shockwaves through Normandy. Marguerite's claim that had assaulted her while her husband was away wasn't just a matter of crime. It was a stain on the name that could only be cleansed by blood. Yet, had powerful allies, including his lord, Count Pierre, who refused to let the accusation stand. With Marguerite's testimony dismissed in court due to her gender and status, Jean was left with one grim option: demand a trial by combat. God, it was believed, would grant victory to the righteous. The duel itself was a spectacle of raw emotion and meticulous ritual. Thousands gathered in a Paris field, their breaths visible in the cold December air, as the 2 knights swore oaths before King Charles VI. Clad in armor etched with crosses, fought not just for justice, but for his wife's voice in a world that had silenced her. Confident in his lord's backing, trusted his skill and the whims of fate. What followed was a brutal, grinding clash, horses charging, lances splintering, then the desperate dance of swords. In the end, it was who pinned his rival to the mud, forcing a confession before delivering the final blow. But the real drama lay in the aftermath. While the crowd cheered, seeing divine judgment in victory, the duel exposed the cracks in a system that equated might with truth. Death didn't just settle the case, it ignited debates across France. How many innocent men had fallen because they lacked the skill to defend themselves? How many accusers, like Marguerite, had been a fair hearing? The scandal pressured courts to rely less on combat and more on evidence, planting early seeds for legal reforms that would unfold over centuries. This duel's legacy wasn't just about one knight's vindication. It was a turning point where medieval Europe began questioning whether justice should ever hinge on the swing of a sword. Triumph restored his honor, but it also forced a kingdom to confront the price of letting steel decide the truth. Henry of gripped the hilt of his sword, not to strike a blow, but to make a point that would echo across Castile. The year was 1367, and the kingdom stood divided in the brutal War of the Two Peters, a conflict that pitted Henry against his half-brother, the Cruel, in a struggle for the throne. What unfolded wasn't just a war of armies, but a psychological duel where the mere threat of single combat became a weapon sharper than any blade. The challenge itself was Henry, knowing's reputation for brutality had turned even his allies against him, publicly demanded they settle their feud face to face on the battlefield. It wasn't just about honor, it was theater, a chance to expose cowardice or force him into a fight he might lose. Cunning but wary, refused. That refusal spoke louder than any victory. To the nobles watching, it confirmed Henry's narrative, that their king was a tyrant who ruled through fear, not the courage expected of a medieval monarch. Yet the duel's power lay in its absence. By forcing to decline, Henry didn't just weaken his brother's legitimacy, he transformed himself into the champion Castile needed. The psychological toll was undeniable. Allies began to question their loyalty, while Henry's ranks swelled with knights who saw in him the qualities of a true leader, willingness to risk everything for what he believed was right. When their forces finally clashed at the Battle of, Henry's defeat seemed to spell the end of his ambitions. But the seeds planted by that unanswered challenge bore fruit. Within 2 years, Henry returned, toppling with the support of a nobility that had lost faith in their king's right to rule. This was a duel fought not with swords, but with perception. Henry understood what did not, that in medieval politics, the appearance of courage could be as vital as the reality. His gambit revealed a timeless truth. Sometimes, the battles that shape history aren't the ones waged on fields, but the ones waged in the minds of those who choose sides. By weaponizing the expectation of single combat, Henry didn't just win a crown, he rewrote the rules of how power could be seized. The sun blazed over the rocky hills of southern Italy as if tightened his grip on his sword, facing a Byzantine champion twice his size. The year was 1042, and the air crackled with more than just the heat of battle. This was a clash of futures. For the Normans, a people still carving their place in the world, this duel wasn't just about survival. It was about proving they belonged among the great powers of the Mediterranean. And though young and untested in the eyes of the empire, carried the weight of his people's ambition on his shoulders. What made this confrontation so pivotal wasn't just the skill of the fighters, it was the symbolism. The Byzantines, heirs to Rome's legacy, saw the Normans as little more than mercenaries, hired swords with no rightful claim to the land. Their champion, a veteran of countless campaigns, stepped forward expecting an easy victory, but fought with something far more dangerous than strength, a desperate cunning. He dodged the Byzantines' heavy strikes, using the uneven terrain to his advantage, turning the champion's confidence into recklessness. When the final blow landed, it wasn't just a man who fell, it was the illusion of Byzantine invincibility. The ripple effect was immediate. His victory became a legend among the Normans, proof that they could stand toe-to-toe with an empire. His triumph galvanized his kinsmen, including his famous brother Robert, who would later lead the conquest of Sicily. Suddenly, the Normans weren't just hired blades, they were a force to be reckoned with, their right to rule stamped in the blood of that duel. But the real genius of this moment lay in its timing. Southern Italy was a patchwork of feuding lords and crumbling Byzantine authority, ripe for the taking. His win didn't just inspire his people, it sent a message to the locals. Here was a leader who could protect them, who could defy the distant emperor in Constantinople. Villages that might have resisted Norman rule instead opened their gates, seeing in the promise of stability. This is how legends forge empires. One duel, fought on a forgotten hillside, didn't just decide the fate of two men, it reshaped the destiny of the Mediterranean. The Normans went from outsiders to kings, and it all began with a young warrior who refused to back down. The walls of Calais loomed over a silent battlefield in the summer of 1347, where the fate of a city, and perhaps a kingdom, hung on the edge of a sword. The 100 Years' War had ground to a stalemate, with Edward III's English forces starving the French into submission through a brutal siege. But when a French knight, clad in polished armor, rode forth to challenge any English warrior to single combat, it wasn't just a test of strength. It was a desperate gamble to sway the heavens themselves. Edward knew the stakes. Accepting the duel meant more than defending English honor. It was a chance to prove his claim to the French throne wasn't just political maneuvering, but a divine right. His champion, a lesser-known knight whose name history barely remembers, carried that weight as he stepped forward. The French fighter was no ordinary opponent. He was handpicked for his skill, a symbol of resistance against the English invaders. Yet what unfolded was in Edward's understanding of medieval theater. His champion didn't just win, he dominated, turning the duel into a spectacle that left the French garrison watching in stunned silence. The aftermath was even more telling. When the French King Philip VI refused to honor the duel's outcome, claiming his knight had acted without orders, it exposed a fracture in French leadership. For Edward, the victory was never about forcing Calais' surrender. It was about perception. His men, weary from months of siege, now saw their king as the embodiment of chivalric virtue, a leader who could back his ambitions with steel. The French, meanwhile, faced the bitter truth that even their bravest couldn't stem the tide. This duel's brilliance lay in its symbolism. Edward didn't need the fight to take Calais. Starvation would do that. What he needed was a legend, a moment to crystallize his image as both warrior and rightful ruler. By the time the city fell weeks later, the story of his champion's victory had already spread through Europe, a propaganda coup sharper than any sword. Wars aren't just won on battlefields. They're won in the hearts of those who believe in the cause. And that day outside Calais, Edward made sure they believed. Wales in the early 15th century was a land simmering with rebellion, its people crushed under English rule but never broken in spirit. Then came the moment that would be whispered about in taverns for generations. A lone Welsh champion stepping onto the field to face an English knight, not just as warriors, but as symbols of their people's struggle. The year was 1401 and had ignited a fire of resistance across the valleys. This duel wasn't about territory or titles. It was about proving that Wales could stand tall against an empire. The English knight, clad in polished armor that gleamed like the crown's authority, expected an easy victory. The Welsh fighter, whose name history never recorded, carried something far more powerful than steel, the hopes of an entire nation. What unfolded was more than a clash of blades. It was raw defiance distilled into a single, electrifying fight. The Welshmen fought with the desperation of a people pushed to the edge, turning the knight's arrogance against him. When the final blow landed and the Englishman fell, it wasn't just a body in the dirt. It was a crack in the illusion of invincibility that had kept Wales subdued for so long. News of the duel spread like wildfire. Villagers who had hesitated to join's revolt now saw proof that the English could be beaten. The champion's victory became a rallying cry, stitching together scattered bands of rebels into something resembling an army. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed Wales might shake off its chains. Shrewd as he was brave, understood the power of symbols. He didn't just need soldiers, he needed stories that could stir the soul. This duel gave him both. Yet history is rarely kind to underdogs. Despite early triumphs, the rebellion faltered under the weight of England's resources. Castles were retaken, fields burned and vanished into legend. But the duel of his unnamed champion lived on, a spark that refused to be extinguished. Centuries later, Welsh poets still sang of that day, not because it changed the war's outcome, but because it revealed a deeper truth. Even in defeat, there's power in standing up. That lone fighter's courage became a mirror held up to every Welsh heart, reminding them that some battles are worth fighting, regardless of the odds. What makes this duel so haunting isn't the steel or the strategy. It's the way it transcends its moment. Most medieval duels decided the fate of individuals. This one became the soul of a nation's identity. Long after rebellion faded, that champion's victory whispered to future generations. Resistance is never futile when it keeps a people's spirit alive. Of Luxembourg tightened his grip on his sword as the Ottoman champion advanced, the weight of Christian Europe's hopes resting on his shoulders. The year was 1396, and the fields of Boar witnessed to a clash far greater than two men. It was a collision of empires. The Crusader army, a patchwork of knights from across the continent, had marched to halt the Ottoman tide. But now, faced with Sultan's disciplined forces, their confidence wavered. The duel was meant to buy time, a desperate gambit to rally their ranks. What unfolded, however, was a lesson in the shifting balance of power, one that would echo through the centuries. The Ottoman champion moved like a storm, his scimitar flashing with lethal precision. Though a skilled warrior, fought not just a man but the relentless momentum of history. Every parry, every dodge was a battle against inevitability. When the emperor's blade finally shattered and he was forced to flee on horseback, the message was clear. The old order could no longer stand against the rising Ottomans. His survival was a miracle, but the Crusaders' defeat that followed was anything but accidental. The battle became a slaughter, a grim preview of the Ottoman dominance that would soon stretch from the Balkans to the gates of Vienna. Yet the duel's true significance lay in its aftermath. His narrow escape didn't just save his life, it preserved his legacy. He returned to Europe a chastened but wiser ruler, one who understood that the Ottomans couldn't be stopped by brute force alone. His later efforts to unite fractious Christian kingdoms against their common foe laid the groundwork for future resistance. But the lesson was indelible. The age of Crusader glory was fading, and a new power had risen in the East. This wasn't just a fight between two warriors. It was a turning point where the medieval world glimpsed its future. The Ottomans, once seen as invaders, would become architects of an empire that endured for centuries. And its duel, though a failure in the moment, became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in defeat, the seeds of strategy and survival could take root. The halls of the Armagnac estate had witnessed generations of power and prestige, until a single duel tore it all apart. The year was 1455, and France's nobility watched in stunned silence as two brothers, Jean V and Charles, raised swords against each other not for glory, but for the right to inherit their father's legacy. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a seismic crack in one of the kingdom's most formidable dynasties, a feud that would leave the Armagnacs vulnerable to rivals and reshape the balance of power in southern France. What made this duel so devastating wasn't the fight itself, but the roots of the conflict. Their father, Count Jean IV, had played a dangerous game, favoring Charles while grooming Jean as his heir, a recipe for resentment that boiled over the moment the old count died. The brothers, once bound by blood, now saw each other as obstacles. Jean, the elder, clung to tradition, insisting primogeniture made his claim unshakable. Charles, charismatic and ambitious, allies who saw him as the better ruler. When negotiations collapsed, steel became the only language left. The duel itself was a grim spectacle. Held under the watch of nervous nobles, it lacked the pageantry of chivalric combat. This was raw, personal, and lethal. Jean, though rightful heir, fought with the desperation of a man who knew losing meant oblivion. Charles, confident in his youth and skill, underestimated his brother's resolve. The clash was brutal but brief. When Jean's blade found its mark, Charles lay dead, and the Armagnac line was irrevocably shattered. Yet the true tragedy unfolded in the aftermath. Jean's victory came at a catastrophic cost. The family's vassals, horrified by the fratricide, began to question their loyalty. Rival houses like the Bourbons, sensing weakness, encroached on Armagnac lands. The duel hadn't just claimed a life, it had gutted a dynasty's unity at the worst possible moment, as France itself reeled from the 100 Years' War. The lesson was clear. Even the mightiest families could crumble from within when ambition overrode kinship. But the story holds a deeper irony. Jean, having sacrificed his brother to secure his future, would spend the rest of his reign embattled, haunted by the ghost of his choices. The duel that was meant to solidify his power instead became a symbol of its fragility. In the end, the Armagnac's fate serves as a timeless warning. When the sword decides succession, no one truly wins. The morning mist clung to the stones of the bridge's pier. The man history would remember as the Chevalier tightened the straps of his armor. The year was 1503, and the fate of Naples, and perhaps all of Italy, rested on this narrow crossing. Behind him lay the shattered remnants of the French army, retreating after a brutal defeat. Ahead, 200 Spanish soldiers advanced, their pikes glinting in the pale light, had no orders to stand his ground. No king commanded this act of defiance. Only one thing drove him: the unshakable code of a knight who believed that honor wasn't just a word, but a force that could bend history itself. What unfolded that day wasn't just a battle. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Armed with nothing but his sword, his wits, and an almost reckless confidence, didn't merely block the bridge. He turned it into a stage. With every Spanish charge, he taunted them, dodged their blows, and struck with surgical precision, all while shouting challenges that echoed across the river. The Spaniards, expecting to overrun a lone defender, found themselves facing a legend in the making. Hours passed and still held. His defiance wasn't just about strength, it was theater, a performance so audacious that it froze an entire army in its tracks. The real brilliance of this stand lay in its timing. The French retreat had been a disaster, morale in tatters. But Duel, though fought against impossible odds, bought his comrades the precious hours they needed to regroup. By the time the Spanish finally, exhausted and bewildered, the story had already spread like wildfire through both armies. The French, moments ago on the brink of collapse, now had a symbol to rally around. The Spanish, though victorious in the larger campaign, would never forget the knight who'd humiliated 200 of their best with nothing but sheer audacity. But's legacy didn't end at the bridge. In an era where gunpowder was rendering knights obsolete, his stand became a beacon of chivalry's enduring power. Kings and poets alike celebrated him as the knight without fear and beyond reproach, a living relic of an idealized past. His fame shielded the French monarchy at a time when its legitimacy was fraying, proving that one man's valor could still shape the destiny of nations. The irony, himself never sought immortality. He fought not for glory, but because to retreat would have betrayed everything he stood for. And that's why his story endures, not as a tale of victory or defeat, but as a reminder that even in an age of cannons and mercenaries, the choices of a single individual can ripple through centuries. The bridge at May have been just stone and water, but for one impossible day, it became the fulcrum on which history turned. Scotland in the year 1330 was a kingdom still gasping for breath after decades of war. Robert had secured independence, but his death left a fragile legacy. A child king, David II, and nobles jostling like wolves for influence. In this powder keg of ambition, one duel would decide who ruled the Highlands: Sir James, the black, feared guardian of the young king, and Earl of Mar, a rival whose bloodline gave him equal claim to power. What unfolded wasn't just a test of strength. It was in how a single clash of steel could rewrite the rules of an entire realm. The tension had been building for months. Mar, backed by disaffected lords who chafed under his regency, saw his chance to seize control. Ever the pragmatist, knew that open war would shatter Scotland's hard-won unity. So when Mar issued his challenge, framing it as a trial by combat to determine God's chosen leader, accepted without hesitation. The battlefield they chose was a windswept moor near Perth, where the very ground seemed to hold its breath as the two men circled each other. Fought with the cold precision that had made him legendary, every parry, every strike calculated to exploit Mar's impatience. The Earl, younger and stronger, relied on brute force, his swings wide and furious. But rage makes for poor strategy. When feigned a stumble, Mar took the bait, overextending just enough for the black to drive his blade home. The gasp from the assembled nobles wasn't just shock at the kill. It was the sound of political reality shifting in an instant. Yet the real victory came afterward. With Mar dead, didn't just claim power, he cemented it. He pardoned the Earl's supporters, binding them to the young king's cause with a mix of mercy and steel. In one stroke, he'd proven that loyalty to his legacy wasn't just preferable, it was the only path forward. The Highlands, so often a cauldron of rebellion, fell quiet. But this duel's brilliance lay in its symbolism. By defeating Mar in single combat, didn't just eliminate a rival, he legitimized his rule in the eyes of a culture that revered martial prowess. His victory became a parable. Challenge the king's guardian, and you challenged the divine order itself. For Scotland, it meant another generation of stability under the dynasty. For history, it was a reminder that sometimes The way to unite a fractured land is to let two men decide its fate on a lonely stretch of moorland. The Black Falcon of Anjou wasn't a man who waited for wars, he created them. By the year 1006, his name alone could send shivers through the Loire Valley, not just for his brutality, but for his uncanny ability to turn any confrontation into an opportunity. When a rival lord challenged him to single combat over disputed lands, didn't just see a duel, he saw a stage. The fight itself was almost secondary. What mattered was the message it would send. The duel's setup was pure theater. Chose a sun-baked field near Tours where the local bishop could bear witness. His opponent, confident in his own strength, expected a straightforward clash of skill, but had other plans. Midway through the fight, as the two men locked swords, his knights suddenly surged forward, encircling the combatants. The challenger, realizing too late that he'd been trapped, had no choice but to yield. Some chroniclers called it treachery, called it strategy. In his mind, the rules of honor were flexible when the prize was Anjou's survival. What makes this moment so revealing isn't just the duel's outcome, it's the aftermath. Didn't kill his defeated rival. Instead, he forced a humiliating public oath, stripping the man of his claims while leaving him alive as a living cautionary tale. Word spread swiftly, cross the Black Falcon, and you'd lose not just your land, but your dignity. Over the next 3 decades, would fight at least 5 more duels, each time blending raw aggression with psychological warfare. He'd arrive late to unnerve opponents, demand combat at dawn to exploit fatigue, or even feign injury to lure enemies into overconfidence. Yet beneath the ruthlessness lay a deeper calculation. Understood that in a fractured medieval world, reputation was currency. By dominating these duels, fairly or otherwise, he wasn't just defending borders, he was crafting a myth. His descendants, the Plantagenets, would inherit not just Anjou, but the aura of invincibility he'd forged. When Henry II later ruled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, he owed part of that legacy to a count who turned single combat into a dynastic weapon. The lesson here transcends the clash of steel. Duels remind us that in medieval power struggles, victory wasn't always about who swung the hardest. It was about who told the best story. His blend of cunning and cruelty reshaped the rules of engagement, proving that sometimes the sharpest blade is the one that carves fear into memory. The frozen marshes of Lithuania in 1389 were more than just. They were the front lines of a holy war that had raged for generations. The Teutonic knights, clad in their iconic white mantles emblazoned with black crosses, saw themselves as God's chosen warriors, tasked with crushing paganism underfoot. But the Lithuanians, though outmatched in numbers and technology, fought with the ferocity of a people defending not just their land, but their gods. When a Teutonic champion strode forward to challenge the finest warrior Lithuania could offer, the duel that followed wasn't merely about strength. It was a cosmic showdown between two worlds. The Lithuanian fighter, whose name history never recorded, carried the hopes of his people in every swing of his axe. Unlike the knight's polished steel, his weapon was rough-forged, its edge honed by generations of forest battles. The clash was brutal, a dance of desperation versus discipline. The knight, trained in the precise art of European combat, with mechanical efficiency, while the Lithuanian moved like a force of nature, his strikes unpredictable as a winter storm. But in the end, it was the knight's blade that found its mark. And as the champion fell, the Teutonic ranks erupted in triumphant cries. To them, this wasn't just a victory, it was divine affirmation, proof that God favored their crusade. Yet history has a way of mocking such certainties. While the knights celebrated, Lithuania's Grand Duke was already plotting a far subtler strategy. Just 3 years later, he would shock Christendom by embracing baptism, not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. His conversion to Christianity, sealed by marriage to Poland's queen, transformed Lithuania from a pagan holdout into a European power overnight. The Teutonic Order, robbed of their holy justification, found themselves isolated, their crusade crumbling not from military defeat, but from the sheer cunning of diplomacy. This duel's legacy is one of profound irony. The knights' victory, so loudly hailed as a sign from heaven, became a footnote in the face of political genius. It's a reminder that faith and force are rarely enough to reshape the world. Sometimes, the most decisive battles are waged with treaties, not swords. The Teutonic champion may have won the day, but the Lithuanians, in their own way, won the future. Jean Luxembourg raised his visor just enough to feel the biting wind of Bohemia's winter, his breath misting in the cold air as he studied the Hussite warrior across the field. The year was 1420, and the siege of Kassel had reached a boiling point. Hungry defenders inside the walls, furious attackers outside, and a warlord named who refused to bow to Burgundian might. Whence champion rode forward, demanding single combat to decide the fate of the siege, Jean accepted without hesitation. This was how noble wars were meant to be fought. Honor against honor, steel against steel. But the duel that followed would expose the ugly truth lurking beneath chivalry's gleaming surface. The two knights met in the no-man's land between armies, their swords ringing in the brittle air. For a few heartbeats, it seemed the old ideals might prevail, until a crossbow bolt hissed from the Hussite lines, striking the challenger dead before Jean could land a blow. The Burgundians roared in outrage, crying treachery, while the Hussites shouted back, claiming the shot was divine judgment. In an instant, the duel's carefully staged ritual collapsed into chaos. Jean, still mounted, found himself staring at a corpse and a shattered code. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer a war of knights, but of survival. What makes this moment so revealing isn't just the broken rules. It's the fault line it exposed in medieval warfare. The Hussites, radical reformers who saw the church as corrupt, fought with a zeal that dismissed chivalry as a hollow game. Their tactics, wagons chained into fortresses, peasant soldiers with flails, were designed to humble armored nobility. To them, Jean's duel was a relic, a performance for an audience that no longer existed. The crossbow bolt was merely punctuation on a sentence they'd been writing for years. War had changed, and honor wouldn't stop a cannonball. Yet Jean's story doesn't end in disillusionment. The failed duel became a turning point in his career, forcing him to adapt or perish. Within months, he abandoned pure knightly combat for mixed forces, flanking his cavalry, mercenaries supplementing noble retinues. It was a grudging admission that the age of untainted chivalry was fading, but also proof that the greatest warriors weren't those who clung to tradition, but those who could bend without breaking. His later victories against the Hussites owed less to glorious charges and more to this hard-won pragmatism. The irony, Jean's name survived not because he upheld the old ways, but because he learned to navigate the new. The duel at, though a footnote in most histories, captures a pivotal shift. The moment Europe's warrior class began to realize that ideals alone couldn't hold back the tide of change. For every Burgundian knight who cursed the crossbowman that day, there was a future commander taking notes, understanding that the next era of warfare would reward flexibility over fanfare. Sometimes, history's most important battles aren't the ones fought with swords, but the ones fought in the mind. The morning fog clung to the tournament grounds at Pamplona as two armored figures took their positions, their identical names echoing through the hushed crowd, both men called, or Rowland in the tongues of the north. But this was no friendly joust between comrades. The year was 1285, and these knights stood ready to fight not for land or love, but over something far more precious to men of their station: the right to bear a specific heraldic symbol. What might have been a petty squabble between nobles instead became a landmark moment, proving that even the flash of steel could shape the laws that governed an entire class. At first glance, the dispute seemed trivial. Both Rowlands claimed ancestral rights to a particular arrangement of lions and fleur-de-lis on their shields. Yet heraldry was anything but frivolous in medieval Europe. A coat of arms wasn't just decoration. It was a knight's identity, his family's reputation distilled into colors and patterns. For two men to claim the same design wasn't just confusing, it threatened the very system that kept aristocratic privilege intact. The local court, unwilling to arbitrate such a volatile matter, deferred to an ancient solution: let God decide. The Rowlands would duel, and the victor would walk away with more than just bragging rights. He'd secure legal ownership of the disputed emblem for his bloodline. The fight itself was a spectacle of precision over brutality. Unlike battlefield clashes, where raw strength often decided the day, this duel was a measured dance of technique and stamina. Both Rowlands fought conservatively, each knowing a single misstep could erase generations of hard-won status. When the younger Rowland finally disarmed his opponent with a deft twist of his blade, the crowd erupted, not just at the skill on display, but at the gravity of what had been settled. The verdict was immediate and irrevocable. The symbol belonged to the victor's house, and the loser's descendants would need to alter their arms or face accusations of fraud. But the real significance lay in the ripple effect. News of the duel spread through royal courts like wildfire, and soon, similar disputes were being resolved not through lengthy legal battles, but through controlled combat. Kings and dukes, eager to avoid petty squabbles clogging their courts, began codifying the practice. By the 14th century, heraldic duels had become a sanctioned method of resolving these conflicts, complete with strict rules about eligible participants and approved weapons. The Rowlands' clash had inadvertently created a system where aristocratic honor could be defended without destabilizing the social order. What makes this duel so fascinating isn't the bloodshed, it's the bureaucracy. In an age where violence often led to chaos, here was proof that even combat could be harnessed as a tool of governance. The two Rowlands didn't just fight for a symbol. They fought for the idea that some disputes were too personal, too visceral, for parchment and seals alone. And in doing so, they left a legacy far more enduring than any heraldic crest, a reminder that sometimes the law needs the weight of steel behind it to be truly respected. Could feel the eyes of two kingdoms upon him as he tightened the straps of his gauntlet. The year was 1371, and France and England stood in an uneasy truce. But for this French lord, peace meant nothing when honor hung in the balance. The insult had been deliberate. An English knight, emboldened by the ceasefire, had openly mocked lineage in a crowded tournament hall, suggesting his bloodline was tainted by cowardice. In that moment, politics faded to irrelevance. Issued a challenge, not as a representative of France, but as a man whose very identity had been attacked. What followed wasn't just a duel. It was a clash between the rigid structures of diplomacy and the white-hot fury of personal pride. The fight itself was in controlled rage. Though younger, fought with the precision of a man who understood that every strike carried the weight of generations. His opponent, a seasoned English warrior, underestimated the depth of that anger until it was too late. When blade finally found its mark, the crowd fell silent. The English knight lay dead, the truce technically violated, and the consequences loomed large. But here, where the story twists, instead of condemning, King Edward III of England, himself a man who valued chivalric honor, granted a full pardon. The message was clear. Some transgressions transcended national borders, and the code of knighthood could override even royal decrees. This duel's brilliance lies in its contradictions. On the surface, it appears to be a reckless act that risked reigniting war. Yet in reality, it reinforced an unspoken rule among medieval nobility. Personal honor wasn't just a private matter. It was the glue holding the entire feudal system together. By pardoning, Edward acknowledged what every aristocrat understood. A man who didn't defend his name was unfit to rule. The duel became a spectacle with purpose, reminding both nations that while kings could declare truces, only God could judge a knight's righteousness. But story doesn't end on the battlefield. His victory catapulted him into legend, proving that reputation could be a sharper weapon than any sword. Years later, when he negotiated with English lords as a trusted intermediary, it was his unwavering sense of honor, forged in that duel, that made his word unshakable. The irony, the very act that diplomacy ultimately made him indispensable to it. In a world where alliances shifted like sand, men like became the rare constants. Their credibility built on moments when they'd chosen principle over politics. What lingers isn't just the clash of steel, but the quiet revolution it represented. This duel revealed the limits of royal authority in the face of aristocratic pride, a tension that would shape European politics for centuries. Defiance wasn't lawlessness. It was a reminder that even kings relied on the loyalty of men who answered first to their own conscience. And in that truth lies the heart of medieval power. Sometimes, the most binding contracts weren't written on parchment, but in blood spilled beneath an open sky. The gates of castles stood shut against the advancing French army, its Norman defenders clutching their weapons with the grim determination of men who knew surrender meant disgrace. The year was 1449, and the reconquest of Normandy had reached a tipping point. Every fortress taken brought King Charles VII closer to finally expelling the English after decades of war. But sieges were costly, bloody affairs, and when the Duke of proposed an alternative, both sides listened. His champion, a knight whose name history barely remembers, would face the castle's finest warrior in single combat. The prize, not just glory, but the fate of the stronghold itself. What unfolded was less a battle than a carefully staged drama. The champions met in the open field between armies, their armor polished to catch the afternoon light, their movements deliberate as actors in a sacred play. Every parry, every feint, was amplified by the watching thousands, gasps rippling through the ranks like wind through wheat. The Norman fought with the desperation of a man defending his home, the French knight with the precision of a soldier who knew victory here could spare countless lives. When the final blow landed, and the Norman champion yielded, the castle's gates creaked open without another drop of blood spilled. But the real genius of this duel lay in its symbolism. A master of medieval psychology understood that spectacle could achieve what brute force could not. By staging the fight as a chivalric ritual, sworn oaths, heralds announcing each move, he transformed what might have been seen as coercion into a divine verdict. The defenders, having witnessed their best warrior fall fairly, could surrender without shame. The French, meanwhile, avoided the morale toll of a protracted siege. In an era where honor mattered as much as territory, this duel didn't just win a castle. It preserved the illusion of noble virtue amidst the ugliness of war. Yet the aftermath reveals an even deeper lesson. It wasn't an isolated incident. News of the duel spread through Normandy like wildfire, and within months, other garrisons began offering their own champions rather than enduring sieges. Had inadvertently created a template, one where controlled, ceremonial violence could replace wholesale slaughter. For the French crown, it was a revelation. Why waste men and months battering walls when a single knight's skill could achieve the same end? This duel's legacy is one of paradox. While it celebrated the fading ideals of chivalry, it also exposed their utility as tools of realpolitik. The knights who fought it may have believed they were upholding tradition, but in truth, they were pioneers of a new kind of warfare, one where perception mattered as much as power. Centuries later, as diplomats replaced champions at negotiating tables, the echoes of that afternoon still lingered. Sometimes, the most effective battles are the ones fought not to destroy an enemy, but to give them a way out with dignity intact. The streets of Milan fell unnervingly silent on the morning of August 13th, 1447, as Duke Maria, last of his name, rode out to meet his challenger. The air smelled of impending rain, but the real storm had been brewing for years. His opponent wasn't just another noble seeking glory. It was a mercenary captain turned rival whose ambition threatened to unravel everything the dynasty had built over 2 centuries. What made this duel so pivotal wasn't the clash of steel alone, but the vacuum it would leave behind. A vacuum that would suck all of Italy into its chaos. Maria had ruled Milan with a mix of cunning and paranoia, clinging to power despite having no male heir. His daughter's marriage had been a desperate gambit, an attempt to control the man who might otherwise overthrow him. But alliances in Renaissance Italy were as stable as smoke. When ambitions outgrew his loyalty, the Duke saw no alternative but to settle their feud the old way, face to face, with the entire city as witness. The duel itself was a brutal, pragmatic affair. Gone were the romantic ideals of chivalry. This was raw survival. Past his prime and weakened by illness, fought with the frantic energy of a man who knew his death would mean extinction. Younger and battle-hardened, countered every strike with cold efficiency. When the Duke's sword clattered to the cobblestones, so too did the future of Milan. The consequences erupted instantly. Without a clear heir, Milan became a prize up for grabs. its riches and strategic position igniting a scramble that would redefine the Italian peninsula. France's Charles VIII, eyeing the prosperous city-state for decades, saw his chance and marched south, kicking off the Italian wars that would drag on for generations. The Habsburgs, equally hungry for influence, countered by backing's claim, turning what should have been a local succession dispute into a proxy battle between Europe's superpowers. This fall didn't just change Milan, it shattered the delicate balance of power that had kept Italy's city-states in uneasy equilibrium. Yet the true tragedy lay in the dynasty's legacy. They had been patrons of art, architects of Milan's grandeur, their emblem, the viper, symbolizing both danger and renewal. Now, their cultural contributions risked being overshadowed by the political firestorm their extinction unleashed. For all his military genius, would spend his reign fending off foreign invasions rather than building on their foundations. The duel's aftermath became a cautionary tale for Renaissance rulers. A single moment of violence could erase generations of achievement, and no amount of cunning could outmaneuver the tides of ambition. What lingers isn't just the blood spilled that day, but the lesson it taught Europe. Power vacuums don't stay empty for long. Maria's fatal mistake wasn't losing the duel, it was failing to secure a future beyond his own sword arm. In the end, his death proved that even the mightiest dynasties are just one ill-fated clash away from becoming footnotes in history's grand, relentless march. The fog hung thick over field in the bitter March of 1461, muffling the sound of 30,000 men preparing for what would become the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. But before the armies clashed, a hush fell over the field as two figures emerged, one bearing the white rose of York, the other the red rose of Lancaster. This wasn't just a prelude to carnage. It was a ritual as old as knighthood itself, a final attempt to let steel decide what politics could not. The Yorkist champion, a hardened veteran of the French wars, moved with the precision of a man who'd spent his life turning violence into craft. His Lancastrian counterpart, younger but no less skilled, carried the desperation of a house fighting for survival. Their duel was meant to be symbolic, a chivalric gesture to inspire their sides. But as their swords sparked in the cold air, it became something far darker. Neither could gain the upper hand. Every strike was met with an equal parry, every feint countered with instinctive grace. After nearly an hour of exhausting combat, both men their strength spent but neither yielding. The message was unmistakable. This conflict wouldn't be settled by champions, but by slaughter. What makes this moment so haunting isn't the fight itself, but what it foreshadowed. The roses they wore weren't just badges. They were emblems of a feud that had festered for generations, one that no single duel could resolve. When the main battle erupted hours later, it descended into butchery so extreme that chroniclers wrote of rivers running red with noble blood. The chivalric ideals that once governed warfare had crumbled, replaced by a grim new reality where victory meant annihilation. Yet the duel's failure taught England a brutal lesson. For decades, the nobility had clung to the notion that honor could be preserved through ritual combat, but proved that when dynasties clashed, there were no rules, only survivors. The men who watched those champions fight that morning didn't see heroes. They saw a reflection of their own futility. And in that realization lay the true turning point, not just a war between kings, but the death of an era where single combat could shape the fate of nations. The Roses would keep fighting, of course, but from that day forward, every battlefield carried the shadow of, a reminder that some conflicts are too vast, too entrenched, for any one sword to settle. The age of duels as destiny was over. The age of total war had begun. The fields outside Morat were thick with the stench of mud and metal as the Swiss pikeman lowered his weapon. His breath ragged from the effort that had just rewritten history. The year was 1476, and Charles the Bold of Burgundy, the wealthiest, most feared duke in Europe, had brought his vaunted armored cavalry to crush the upstart Swiss Confederacy once and for all. But the battle took a turn no chronicler could have predicted when a lone Burgundian knight, resplendent in gilded plate armor, broke ranks to challenge the Swiss lines. What happened next wasn't just a skirmish. It was the moment the medieval world order cracked open. The knight, bred from childhood to believe mounted nobles were invincible, expected the peasant pikemen to scatter before his charge. Instead, one man stepped forward. Without a horse, without armor, armed only with a pike and raw determination, the Swiss fighter planted his feet and waited. When the knight lunged, the pikeman with the precision of a man who'd spent a lifetime turning defense into art. His pike found the gap between breastplate and helm, a single, lethal thrust that toppled the knight like a felled oak. The Burgundians gasped, the Swiss roared. In that instant, 5 centuries of military doctrine evaporated. But this duel's brilliance lay in its symbolism. The Swiss Confederacy, a loose alliance of mountain farmers and tradesmen, had no knights, no aristocratic elite. Their strength came from discipline, unity, and an unshakable belief that courage wasn't inherited, it was earned. The pikeman's victory became a rallying cry, proof that coordinated infantry could shatter the myth of cavalry supremacy. Within hours, the full Swiss force would rout Charles's army, but the real damage was already done. The sight of a common soldier besting nobility sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. The aftermath rewrote the rules of war. Kings who'd once poured fortunes into armored lancers now scrambled to recruit Swiss-style pike formations. Mercenary companies modeled after the Confederacy's troops became the most sought-after fighters on the continent. Their reputation so fearsome that merely seeing their banners could make armies retreat without a fight. The duel at Morat didn't just win a battle, it heralded a new era where tactics and training trumped birthright, where the battlefield became a democracy of skill. Yet the most enduring legacy was psychological. For centuries, aristocracy had justified its dominance by claiming martial superiority. Now, that illusion lay broken in the mud at Morat. The Swiss champion, whose name history never recorded, became a folk hero not because he was exceptional, but because he proved every common man could be. His pike wasn't just a weapon, it was the first nail in the coffin of feudalism itself. The age of knights was ending. The age of the soldier had begun. The flames crackling around the stake couldn't drown out the defiance in his voice. Paris, 1314, the year the Templar Order, once Christendom's most powerful knights, was crushed under the combined weight of a greedy king and a complicit pope. As smoke curled around the shackled wrists, legends whisper of one final act of rebellion, a duel demanded not for survival, but for vindication. The story goes that, moments before his execution, challenged a papal envoy to single combat, offering to prove the Templars' innocence with his blade where words had failed. Whether the duel truly happened matters less than why the tale endured. In the ashes of the Order's destruction, this imagined clash became something far greater, a symbol of resistance against tyranny, a last stand where honor refused to kneel. What makes this legend so potent isn't its historical accuracy, but its emotional truth. By 1314, trial by combat had been fading from European courts for decades, replaced by inquisitions and political show trials. The Templars' downfall was the ultimate proof of this shift. Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the Order, fabricated charges of heresy, then pressured Pope Clement V to disband them. No champion was allowed to defend the knights in battle. No sword could cut through the web of lies. That's why Phantom Duel resonated. It offered a cathartic alternative to the grim reality, a world where corruption could still be answered with steel. The story's endurance reveals a deeper tension in medieval society. For commoners whispering the tale in taverns, it was a fantasy of justice, proof that even kings and popes might flinch if forced to face their victims openly. For nobles, it was a cautionary fable about the fragility of chivalric ideals in an age of bureaucratic treachery. And for the Church, a discomforting reminder that public perception couldn't always be controlled. The duel that likely never happened became a mirror, reflecting every observer's hopes and fears. Yet the most fascinating twist lies in the legend's afterlife. Centuries later, revolutionaries resurrected story as a rallying cry against monarchy and clerical abuse. Freemasons wove it into their rituals, casting thee as a martyr to Enlightenment values. Even modern conspiracy theories about hidden Templar treasures borrow from the duel's aura of unresolved defiance. The irony is rich. An order destroyed for alleged secrecy became immortal through a public act of imagined courage. This is the alchemy of legendary duels. They transcend their moment, becoming vessels for the values societies wish they'd upheld. Stand, real or not, endures because it answers a timeless human craving for fairness, for a world where power can still be held to account, if only in stories. And in that sense, perhaps the did win his duel after all, not on a Parisian scaffold, but in the hearts of those who refuse to let injustice have the last word. From of Bouillon to the last, these duels were more than personal contests. They were moments where history teetered on a sword's edge. Some decided thrones, others shattered dynasties, but all remind us how individual courage, or cunning, could redirect the tides of power. Think about it. A single fight between two armored figures could topple empires, inspire revolutions, or rewrite the rules of warfare itself. That's the raw, unpredictable drama of the medieval world, where the line between legend and reality was often drawn in blood and steel. What's striking isn't just the scale of these clashes, but the sheer diversity of their consequences. Victory outside Antioch didn't just secure a castle, it propelled him toward kingship. The duel between the Armagnac brothers didn't merely settle a feud, it gutted a dynasty and left France weaker in the wake of war. And who could forget the Swiss pikemen at Marat, whose defiance didn't just kill a knight, it heralded the end of an entire military era. These weren't isolated skirmishes. They were hinges on which history swung wide open. Yet there's a deeper thread tying these stories together. Beyond the clashing steel and spilled blood, each duel reveals something fundamental about power in the Middle Ages. In a world where law was often weak and authority fragmented, personal prowess carried outsized weight. A king might command armies, but his legitimacy could still rest on his willingness to face a challenger blade to blade. A mercenary captain like could rise from obscurity to rule a city, not just through strategy, but by proving his mettle in single combat. These fights were the ultimate test of credibility, a way to silence doubters and rally followers in an age where reputation was currency. But here's the twist. While these duels decided fates in the moment, their true legacy lies in how they shaped the centuries that followed. The fall of the didn't just alter Milan, it dragged Europe into decades of war. The Swiss pikeman's triumph didn't just win a battle, it democratized warfare, paving the way for modern armies. Even's phantom duel, though likely myth, became a rallying cry against corruption that echoes to this day. The ripple effects remind us that history isn't just about broad trends or impersonal forces. Sometimes, it's the choices of individuals, their bravery, their desperation, their pride, that send shockwaves through time. So which duel left the deepest mark? Was it the clash that saved the First Crusade, the one that doomed a dynasty, or the fight that humbled an empire? That's the beauty of history. There's no single answer, only perspectives to debate. Maybe you're drawn to the underdog's triumph or the tragedy of a house divided. Whatever your pick, one thing's certain. These stories aren't just relics of the past. They're mirrors, reflecting timeless truths about ambition, justice, and the fragile nature of power. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this journey through history's most decisive duels, hit subscribe for more tales where courage, cunning, and cold steel collide. The past is waiting, and its lessons are sharper than you